The morning air in London carried the scent of fresh rain, mixing with the aroma of coffee from nearby cafes. Tourists bustled around Buckingham Palace, eager to capture the perfect photo, their laughter and chatter forming a constant hum. Amidst the chaos, one figure stood unshaken, Jonathan Ridley, a royal guardsman. His uniform, crisp red with golden buttons, gleamed under the pale sun. His black bearskin hat towered above the crowd, his expression frozen in an unbreakable stare. Jonathan wasn't here for amusement. He wasn't a statue for tourists to prod or mock. He was a soldier, a symbol of unwavering discipline and honor. And then, he arrived. A tourist, loud and brash, pushed his way to the front. He wore a tacky t-shirt with an offensive slogan, sunglasses perched atop his sunburned face, and ridiculous shorts covered in the British flag. In one hand, he held a half-empty beer bottle. In the other, his phone, already recording. "Oi, mate, give us a smile," he called out, his voice cutting through the morning calm like a blade. Jonathan didn't flinch. He never did. The tourist grinned. He wanted a reaction, something to entertain his followers. He took another step forward, crossing the invisible boundary that separated the crowd from the guardsman. Then, with a smirk, he did the unthinkable. He let the beer bottle slip from his fingers. The glass shattered at Jonathan's feet. A hush fell over the crowd. No one, not even the tourist himself, was prepared for what happened next. The crash of shattering glass echoed across the cobblestone pavement, slicing through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Tourists froze, cameras poised midair, their lenses capturing the tension before anyone could even react. The beer bottle lay in jagged shards at the guardsman's feet, its golden liquid seeping into the cracks of history itself. Jonathan Ridley remained motionless. His disciplined frame did not betray even a flicker of irritation. His gloved hands stayed firm against his rifle. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat, remained locked in that timeless, unyielding stare. But something had changed. The crowd felt it before they saw it. An invisible shift in the air, an unspoken warning woven into the silence. The people closest to the tourist took a step back, instinctively distancing themselves from the man who had crossed an unbreakable line. The tourist, oblivious, smirked. "Oops," he chuckled, lifting his phone higher. "Come on, mate, that was an accident, yeah? Bet you're not even allowed to blink." Still, Jonathan did not move. Somewhere in the crowd, a little girl in a pink raincoat gripped her mother's hand. "Mom, is he in trouble?" she whispered. An elderly man in a gray overcoat exhaled slowly. "He should be." But the tourist was too caught up in his own arrogance to notice the weight of history pressing down on him. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. So with a careless shrug, he took another step forward, step too many. And that's when Jonathan moved. It wasn't much, just one step forward. But to the crowd, to the tourist, to the cameras capturing every second, it was thunder. The precise stomp of Jonathan's boot against the cobblestone cracked like a gunshot. The shift was deliberate, measured, controlled. It was a soldier's step, a warning from history itself. And for the first time, the tourist stumbled back. His smug confidence wavered. The sunglasses slid down his nose. His phone tilted, and for a split second, the camera caught his face, one of pure, naked uncertainty. The crowd felt it. A pulse of energy spread through them, like a wildfire catching the dry edges of their patience. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into hushed gasps. He did it. He moved. The power of that single motion was unlike anything they had expected. The guardsman didn't speak. He didn't need to. That one step was enough to communicate volumes. The tourist's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He let out a nervous laugh, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "Oh, scary," he mocked, but his voice wasn't as steady anymore. His bravado had cracked, if only slightly. The veteran in the crowd, his chest heavy with medals, smiled knowingly. "Discipline isn't silence," he murmured. "It's power." Jonathan Ridley stood tall, unyielding as stone, powerful as the legacy he protected. And now, the tourist, who had once believed the world revolved around him, was beginning to understand. But he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. Not before making one last disastrous mistake. The tourist wasn't done. His ego, now bruised, urged him forward. He refused to be humiliated, especially not by a man who wasn't even allowed to talk back. The crowd's shifting energy, the whispers of disapproval, the eyes locked onto him, it all made him desperate to reclaim control. He forced out a laugh, louder this time, pushing past the unease in his chest. "Come on, man," he sneered, stepping even closer. "You moved. That means you can hear me, yeah?" He waved his phone in Jonathan's face. "Say something for the camera." Still, Jonathan did not respond. The tourist's fingers curled into a fist around his phone. His audience was waiting. His followers would expect something big. He had to make this worth their time. Then, in an act of sheer arrogance, he reached out toward Jonathan's shoulder. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even those who had been watching passively leaned forward. Touching a guardsman was a line that was never to be crossed. And yet, the tourist, drunk on his own audacity, crossed it. His fingertips barely grazed the red fabric when Jonathan moved again. Not aggressively, not emotionally, precisely. With trained efficiency, he swung his rifle, bringing it up in a swift motion that sent the tourist stumbling back. The sharp clack of the rifle's butt against the ground was like a cannon blast in the silent square. The tourist tripped over his own feet. His phone slipped from his grip, clattering onto the stone. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. And that was when the officer stepped in. A uniformed officer had been watching from a short distance, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Now, he stepped forward. The crowd parted for him. The tourist, still recovering from his near fall, turned to face him. He opened his mouth, likely to protest, but the officer spoke first. "You're done." The words weren't shouted, they weren't emotional, they didn't need to be. The authority in them was absolute. The tourist blinked, his bravado faltering. "What? I was just... You disrespected a Queen's Guard. You crossed the line. You're leaving." The tourist chuckled nervously, still playing for the cameras, even if no one was laughing with him. "Oh, come on, mate. It's not that deep. He's just standing there." The officer tilted his head slightly. "And you just made a fool of yourself." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People nodded, some smirked, others shook their heads. The tourist turned back to Jonathan, expecting, what? A reaction? Pity? But Jonathan remained a fortress of silence. The officer stepped closer, voice steady. "Pick up your bottle." The tourist hesitated. Now, swallowing hard, he crouched down, his fingers trembling as he gathered the shards of glass. His hands shook, not from fear of the officer, but from the weight of hundreds of silent, judging eyes. The tourist, once confident, once so sure of his control over the moment, had lost, and the world was watching him. The crowd was still recording. What had started as a childish attempt at humiliation had become a public lesson in respect. The internet would see not a man mocking a guardsman, but a man humiliated by his own arrogance. And the veteran in the crowd knew it. He had served. He had worn a uniform, different from Jonathan's, but carrying the same weight of duty. He watched the tourist closely, his lined face unreadable. Then, as the tourist stood, holding the broken bottle, his face red with embarrassment, the veteran spoke. "Son," he said, voice calm but firm, "you stand before history. You stand before a symbol of something greater than yourself, and instead of respecting it, you chose to mock it." The tourist looked at him, his mouth opening, but no words came out. "Tell me," the veteran continued, his voice gentle yet unyielding, "how does it feel to be the joke instead?" The tourist had no answer. A single clap broke the silence, then another and another. Suddenly the entire crowd was applauding, but not for the tourist, for Jonathan, and for the lesson that had just unfolded before them. The tourist, red-faced and defeated, stood still, staring at the crowd's applause. His pride, once so firm, was now cracked, shattered like the bottle at Jonathan's feet. His body felt heavy, like he was carrying the weight of every disapproving stare. His shoulders hunched, and his head dropped in shame. The cameras that had once zoomed in on his antics now focused on him, but not in admiration. They were capturing the downfall of a man who thought he could control the moment, only to realize he was its victim. The veteran's words echoed in his mind. How does it feel to be the joke instead? He swallowed hard. This wasn't how he imagined his London adventure would end. He wasn't the center of attention anymore. He wasn't the one in control. The crowd's energy had shifted from laughter to disdain. His viral video wasn't going to be a comedic moment. It was a cautionary tale. "Pick up the pieces, mate," someone muttered from the crowd, breaking the silence. The tourist knelt slowly, his fingers shaking as he collected the glass shards from the cobblestone. Every move he made was watched. every action a reminder of his humiliation. As the tourist finished picking up the shards, a strange sense of justice filled the air. It wasn't the harsh kind of justice that left people angry. It was the kind that left them thinking, reflecting. They saw him for what he was, a man so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't recognize the power of respect. The veteran, still standing nearby, was joined by others, some with military backgrounds, others simply ordinary people who understood the value of honor. They exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't just about the Guardsman, it was about something much larger. A few minutes ago, the tourist had believed he had all the power. Now, he was a symbol of what happens when entitlement meets tradition, and the internet would remember. "That's how it should be," a voice echoed softly in the crowd. The veteran, standing tall, nodded toward Jonathan, a silent exchange, a mutual recognition of duty. In that moment, Jonathan didn't need to prove anything. The lesson had already been taught. As the tourist stood up, he glanced around, his eyes searching for some sign of reprieve. But there were no kind faces in the crowd, no one willing to forgive his arrogance. They all saw him for what he was, a man who had disrespected more than just a guard. The veteran's words still hung in the air. "You stand before history." And now the tourist realized the weight of those words. He wasn't just confronting a guardsman, he was facing a tradition that stretched back centuries. A tradition that demanded respect. The laughter had faded, replaced by something far more profound, understanding. Jonathan, silent and steadfast, had become the embodiment of that understanding. His silence was the lesson. The tourist felt small, insignificant. He had no words, no justification. And then, as if compelled by an unseen force, he stuffed his phone back into his pocket. No more jokes, no more attempts at humor, no more power over the situation. He had lost. And in that loss, he understood. True strength wasn't in loudness, it was in stillness. The tourist turned and began to retreat, his back hunched, avoiding the gaze of anyone around him. Every step felt like it was heavier than the last. The crowd began to disperse, the moment passing into history, but it wasn't forgotten. The viral video had already begun its journey. People would share it, discuss it, comment on it, and they would see the story for what it was, a lesson in respect, tradition, and humility. As he shuffled away, he couldn't escape the sound of the applause that still rang in his ears. It wasn't for him. It was for Jonathan, for the patience he had shown, for his unwavering dedication to duty. The woman in the wheelchair, who had watched everything unfold, whispered as he passed. There was a time when people like him wouldn't even be allowed this close. Her words, quiet but clear, stung him more than anything else. He had crossed a line, and the world had watched him fall. The tourist stumbled backward, his face flushed with embarrassment. Every part of him screamed to escape, to leave this place, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The cameras still flashed, the crowd still murmured, and the tension in the air felt almost palpable. For the first time that day, he truly understood the gravity of what had just happened. The bottle, the smug comments, the way he had provoked Jonathan, it had all been a display of arrogance, thinking his money and fame would protect him from the consequences. But there were no consequences for the guardsman. Jonathan stood as still and silent as ever, his posture unwavering. In that stillness, the tourist felt something shift within himself. What he had once perceived as a powerless position. This man, standing in complete silence, a part of the grand tradition of the British military, had actually been a symbol of strength. The kind of strength that came from duty, honor, and respect. And in that moment, the tourist realized he had been wrong. So wrong. It wasn't about winning the moment with a flashy reaction or viral content. It was about the quiet strength to stand firm when everyone around you expected something else. His hand trembled as he reached down to gather the broken glass shards, now an echo of his earlier behavior. Each piece felt like a reminder of his humiliation. His pride had been broken into pieces, much like the bottle, and for the first time, he didn't know how to put it back together. As the tourist clumsily bent to pick up the pieces of his shattered pride, the crowd's tone began to shift. There was no more laughter, no more derisive chuckles. The people around him, initially entertained by his antics, now watched with quiet disapproval. It was as though a collective realization had hit them. The tourist's actions were Not just disrespectful to Jonathan, but to everyone who valued tradition. A few moments passed in tense silence, and then, almost as if by some unspoken agreement, the crowd began to clap. At first, it was just a soft, hesitant applause, but it quickly grew louder. A recognition of the fact that the right thing had been done. That in a world where people often acted without thinking, where disrespect seemed to be growing more common by the day, there was still room for honor and respect. The applause was not for Jonathan alone. It was for the moment, the lesson, and the sense of justice that had been served. Some in the crowd clapped to affirm what they had witnessed. A man had been humbled, but more importantly, the tradition had stood its ground. Others joined in because they realized that sometimes the best way to deal with disrespect was to stand still, unwavering, until the noise died down. The tourist, caught in this wave of unanticipated reaction, felt every clap like a blow to his already fragile ego. His attempt to create a viral spectacle had backfired spectacularly. The people weren't laughing at the Guardsman anymore. They were celebrating the strength of his silence. The applause echoed in the square, but for the tourist it felt like an eternity. The echoes of the crowd's approval were a constant reminder of his mistake. He had believed his actions were justified by his status, but now he felt as small as an insect in a vast, indifferent world. His attempt at humor had failed. His expectation of a grand reaction had crumbled. Nothing had gone according to plan. His eyes darted around the crowd. No one was looking at him with sympathy. Instead, their expressions were a mix of disappointment and pity. He had crossed the line, and the consequences were clear. He had lost their respect. It was then that the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Jonathan's silence, his quiet dignity, was more powerful than any viral reaction or applause he could have hoped for. The crowd was no longer interested in him. The cameras that had once zoomed in on his antics now held steady on Jonathan, capturing his strength, his poise, and the respect that defined him. The tourist wanted to turn and run, to disappear into the crowd, but his legs wouldn't move. He was trapped in this moment. The reality of his failure was too profound to escape. As the tourist finally stood up from the cobblestones, clutching the last of the broken shards, he realized he had no way of fixing what he had done. The people around him weren't laughing anymore. The video footage already recorded his downfall. In that moment, he understood what had truly been lost, not just his pride, but his sense of entitlement. His sense of superiority had been shattered just as easily as the bottle he'd dropped. A voice broke through his thoughts. "You'll never learn until you've been humbled, will you?" A passerby muttered under their breath, their words cutting deep. The tourist didn't respond. He had no response. He had no defense, no excuse. His behavior had been disrespectful. His actions had been thoughtless. And now, he was the one being taught a lesson. It was a lesson that would stick with him for years to come, whether he liked it or not. As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but think back to the moment he had so carelessly approached Jonathan. The utter lack of respect he had shown. The guardsman's stillness had been a mirror, reflecting all of his arrogance and foolishness back at him. Jonathan Ridley stood motionless, his face a mask of stoicism. He didn't move, didn't flinch. His job was simple. He was a symbol of the tradition and honor that had defined Britain for centuries. And in this moment, he was more than just a man in a red uniform. He was the embodiment of strength. The tourist had been right about one thing. Jonathan hadn't reacted. He hadn't needed to. His silence had said everything. The respect that had been earned by centuries of service was more powerful than any outburst, any angry shout. It was something that came from within, something not easily understood by those who thought they could challenge it. In the face of the tourist's mockery, Jonathan had stood firm, and in doing so, he had become a living lesson. A lesson about dignity, humility, and respect. The crowd, watching in silent awe, understood now. This wasn't just about a tourist who had crossed a line. This was about the unspoken power of honor, a power that, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. As Jonathan resumed his post, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Their conversations, once filled with excitement over the tourist's antics, now shifted to discussions of respect and tradition. Somehow, without saying a word, Jonathan had shown them all what it truly meant to stand tall. As the crowd continued to thin, A sudden hush fell over the remaining onlookers. They were still processing what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the drama they had expected. It wasn't the viral moment they had hoped for. But in its place had been something much more profound. A reminder that respect had a weight all its own. Jonathan remained standing, his posture as perfect as when the ordeal had started. He had not wavered when the tourist had tried to provoke him. He had not responded to the taunts or the bottle, choosing instead to remain the immovable force of tradition that he was. And in doing so, he had taught the crowd the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The tourist, meanwhile, was a shadow in the crowd now. His swagger had disappeared, replaced by the deflated posture of someone who knew he had lost. Not just a moment, but something deeper. He wasn't just a tourist anymore. He was a lesson. A cautionary tale to anyone who thought that their money or status could ever make them superior to the principles of honor. His grip on the broken bottle shards was now gone, replaced by the weight of self-awareness that hung on his shoulders like an anchor. And though he tried to walk away, there was no escaping the truth that had been hammered into him that day. The tourist's departure was met with more than just quiet. It was met with a sense of closure, a feeling that something had been restored, not just in the eyes of the onlookers, but in the very air around Buckingham Palace. Jonathan stood at his post, a silent sentinel, and in his stillness, the world seemed to settle. The clamor of the crowd had diminished, and now all that remained was the soft murmur of whispers and the occasional camera click. The veterans who had witnessed the scene nodded quietly to one another. They recognized in Jonathan's calm a sense of resolve, a sense of something that went beyond just guarding a palace. It was about guarding a way of life, a tradition that had been passed down through generations. A tradition that was worth protecting. The elderly woman in the wheelchair, who had shaken her head in disappointment earlier, now allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had lived through times when respect for the military was unquestioned, and while she knew those days were fading, moments like today reminded her that some things would never change. Later that evening, the tourist sat in his hotel room, staring at his phone. His social media feed was flooded with videos of the incident. The initial rush of excitement had faded, replaced by a growing sense of shame. The comments were merciless. No longer were people laughing at Jonathan. Instead, they were praising him, lauding his ability to stand tall in the face of disrespect. They were talking about the tradition he represented, the honor he embodied, and how his silence had been the perfect response. As the tourist scrolled through the endless messages, he could feel the sting of every word. "This is what happens when you cross the line," one comment said. Another read, "Respect is earned, not bought." He had been foolish to think he could get away with it. His arrogance had led him to believe that his money and his status made him untouchable. But now he saw how wrong he had been. The world didn't revolve around him, not even close. The tourist had spent hours reflecting on the events. The regret gnawed at him. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make things right. He called his friend who had been with him at the palace and asked for help. He wanted to send a message to Jonathan, to apologize. Not through a public post or an Instagram story, but in a way that would actually matter. He wanted to show that he understood the lesson. The next day, the tourist made his way back to Buckingham Palace. This time, he was not there to provoke, to entertain, or to get a viral video. He was there because he had learned. When he arrived, he stood in front of the palace for a long moment, looking at Jonathan's post as if he were seeing the world through a new set of eyes. He was different now. Humility, respect, these were not things to be taken lightly. As he approached the Guardsman, he stopped a few feet away, just enough to convey his respect, but not too close to intrude on his space. "I'm sorry," the tourist said, his voice calm and sincere. "I didn't understand before, but I get it now." Jonathan didn't react. He didn't have to. But the moment hung in the air, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. The tourist had learned his lesson. He had learned that there were moments in life when no amount of money or status could save you from the consequences of your actions. He had learned that true strength came from integrity and honor, not from an ability to mock or diminish others. As he turned and left the square, he did so with his head held high. He had come full circle, and though it had taken a humbling experience to get there, he was a changed man. Back at his post, Jonathan remained as steadfast as ever. His gaze never wavered, his posture never faltered. But those who had witnessed the incident, including the tourist, would remember the lesson for the rest of their lives. Respect is earned, and it is not for sale. And in that moment, in the heart of London, it had been taught in the most profound way possible. This story isn't just about a single tourist or a single guardsman. It's about respect, tradition, and the power of silence. In a world where people crave attention and viral moments, this guardsman proved that true strength doesn't come from reacting. It comes from discipline, honor, and self-control. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think about this incident? Do you believe the tourist truly learned his lesson? Have you ever witnessed a moment where respect was tested, but ultimately won? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, share this video with your friends to remind everyone that some things, like honor, are timeless. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss more powerful stories like this.